Is it okay with everybody that this session is recorded? It is going to be uploaded to the Franciscan Institute YouTube channel so that it is made available to people who may not have been able to attend and would like to look at it. Okay. Now that you know it's being recorded, anybody who doesn't wish to be can, of course, turn off their camera so that they're not on the screen. Right, so I'm going to start the presentation and share my screen. Here we go. Okay. So, oops, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. Right. So the objectives today are to give a general understanding of the process of trauma, grief, and loss, and a general understanding of how these are experienced and manifested by children and adolescents. Trauma, grief, and loss are felt and manifested very differently with children and adolescents, but not necessarily any less intensely. Their behaviors are often misunderstood because a lot of the time people think, adults think, well, they don't have any stress, they don't have any trauma, they are over it. And that's not the case at all. Please understand this is going to be very basic for some people, very familiar. For other people, it will hopefully give something new. This is a really broad understanding because it's possible to do an entire course on just any one of these three elements: trauma, grief, or loss. Okay, what is trauma? A sudden or unexpected event, which is potentially or actually life-threatening, where we have little control and we cannot respond effectively to the event because it's really just too big for us. Where we are directly involved in the event or we witness it. And that's an important point to keep in mind. And if the event causes so much stress that it is beyond our normal coping capacity, again, that's very important. Because remember, different individuals, different ages have different coping capacities. Then if all those things are the case, we have experienced a traumatic event. Now, what makes trauma is both the event and your emotional and psychological reaction. The core emotions in response to trauma are terror, disgust, helplessness. It may not be all three of these. Helplessness is usually at the core of it because remember, let me go back a bit. We have little control. We are unable to respond effectively. And then stress that exceeds our normal coping capacities. So there are many things there that come together to make us feel helpless. So helplessness is really at the core of just about all trauma experiences. All right, and your emotions, other emotions may be terror or maybe absolute disgust. Now, there are different levels of trauma. We call them big T, as in capital T traumas, or small t traumas. So the big T, these are life-threatening, or there's actual or threatened serious injury or violence. It happens directly to you, or you witness it or hear about it. So you're very close to it, in other words. Okay, it is something that is very present in your life, even if you're not actually, it doesn't actually happen to you. These are some examples of big T traumas. These are the things that everybody thinks about when you think about trauma. A natural disaster, whenever we live in the Caribbean, we know about hurricanes, we know about flood, we know about all these things. We are not like the US, where it is a big deal when there's a flood. We are accustomed to getting floods, at least in Trinidad and Tobago, every single year. So these are, everybody will consider these a trauma, right?
Excuse me, Karen, can we ask Lenny to mute his mic, please?
Certainly.
We've got a lot of noise in the background. Lenny and Julie still have their mics on. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tina, and thank you both for muting your mics. Things like torture, war, child abuse. If you're an emergency worker, and we're hearing a lot about frontline workers these days, that exposure, all of that, that's big T trauma. And these are things that usually nobody will dispute as a traumatic event. Now, small t, common t, if trauma events, they're not considered to be traumatic. However, we are aware as mental health professionals that these can be just as toxic, because several of these in a person's life can create a trauma response. Sometimes even just one of these can create a trauma response. But something that's often overlooked is when you have an accumulation of small t traumas. There was not one huge event, but there were many small things over the years that can create a trauma response. And these events are considered small t just because they're not actually life-threatening and there's not necessarily any threat of violence. There's no threat of violence in them. But there is the same emotions. They may have less of a, not as major an impact on your life, but they can still have a significant impact and can be very distressing. So examples of some of these for children and adolescents: school difficulties. Anybody here who, let us say, had trouble with reading in school, I'm sure that now, however many years later, you still remember the feelings from that. Conflicts with friends, conflict with teachers. All of these, nothing is life-threatening. Nothing is necessarily going to change your life or take it away, but it has an impact on your life. So these are the small t kinds of traumas. And there are even smaller ones, like the children who, you know, your pencil breaks in the middle of an exam, right? Your friend doesn't want to talk to you. You didn't get picked for the rounders team, or you were the last one to get picked. Things like that. Other examples, non-abusive conflict with your parents. So you may have quite a good relationship with your parents, but there's conflict going on with them for whatever reason. It's not abusive, but it's difficult. And this counts as a small t trauma. A friend moving away, that can be really, really big for a lot of children. And it's something that they really grieve over. Being exposed to traumatic events via the media. If you just think of our nightly news and our daily newspapers, you will understand that that is something that our children get at least once a day, probably twice a day. Now with social media, they can get it all day, every day, because they're the real traumatic events. And then there's the hoaxes that people put on, the myths and stories that circulate on the internet that can be very disturbing, especially the hoaxes about, oh, there's this huge new virus that's going to eat your phone and eat you and eat your house and eat your mother. That, you know, when I say virus, I mean an electronic virus. So this has become more and more to the forefront as social media has developed and become more widespread and is very, very, very widely used by children and adolescents. And then there's loss. Loss is a category of trauma, and loss is one of the major threats to children's mental health. Loss is very, very common. So there are different types of loss. We're not just talking about death. We're talking about other losses. 3 of these are about death, but there's changing schools and leaving friends behind. When a lot of our children have just changed schools for SCA, but many of them may be going to a secondary school that friends are also going to. And there's a lot of excitement around it because it's associated with success and moving on. But I'm talking about when children change schools, not at one of those natural transition stages. They might move from Tobago to Trinidad or from Trinidad to Tobago. And so they've left their friends. Moving to another country, that can count as a big loss. Death of a parent is put separately from death of other family because death of a parent is a major kind of loss for children and adolescents. It's associated with many negative outcomes, including depression in adult life. So death of a parent is probably the most distressing death that a child or adolescent can face. And remember, we're talking about children and adolescents. So this is not death of a parent when, you know, everybody in the family is adult, when it's still distressing and it's still sad, but there's more of an expectation of it. There's a child or adolescent doesn't expect parents to die. Parent separation or divorce, again, this is put separately because this is the commonest type of loss which children will experience. So for children who do experience loss, it's most likely to be this kind of loss. So we used to believe, it used to be the belief that trauma was something unusual and rare. And now we know that between small t and large T traumas, trauma is very, very, very common. It's something that most people are going to experience in their lives at one stage or another. What we also know is that it's often not what we call simple trauma. Simple trauma being a specific event that is contained in time and also is contained, limited in the impact it has on your life. So for instance, being in a car accident where nobody is injured. So the car may be destroyed. It was very traumatic to be hit, to be crashed into, but everybody walks away. So that is one event that happened there. It doesn't necessarily affect your relationships or your view of yourself or other things. It is a discrete and separate trauma. So if you have other things in your life, support systems, you have stability, you have security, you have satisfaction with your life, this will be traumatic. But it's very, very different from when there are many traumatic events, small and large, occurring together in your life. That's when you get complex trauma. And most of the time, traumas, unfortunately, do not come alone. So there are often several that come together, and we're going to see some more of that later on in the presentation. So this is something you must never forget. Trauma changes your brain. Trauma changes your brain. The way the brain functions is affected significantly by trauma. So it's not your feelings got hurt and you are sad, upset, or angry. It goes beyond that. Your brain functions in a different way because of trauma. Sometimes that is only temporary, sometimes it is longer lasting. So, where the child is in his or her development, affects how the trauma is expressed, his or her trauma reactions. Okay? Because there are different things, different priorities in development at each developmental stage. The child starts off with needing to experience the world as safe. Safety is the first psychological job that a child has. Learning to feel safe. That's as a baby. Toddlerhood, you're going on to independence and autonomy. So learning that you can separate and do things on your own. And that's the toddler stage. So trauma has different effects at different stages. So I'm going to leave this one for a little while so people can look at it and absorb it. The reason children spend a lot of energy dealing with the trauma, responding, coping, coming to terms with it, is because, as I said, trauma has an actual neurological impact. So the changes in functioning, at least temporary changes in functioning, create a lot of work for the brain to do, for the brain to regulate itself to return to a balanced state of functioning. And that is a lot of work. What a trauma can do in an instant can take months, sometimes years, for the brain to correct, especially if it's doing it without any external help. So therefore, if your brain is trying to regulate itself, then you have less time to explore and to master your environment, because a big part of maturing and developing is learning your environment and learning to master it, learning that you can do things in this environment, that you can handle objects, that you can use objects, that you can cause things to happen, that you can achieve things. All of that is part of exploring the environment. So it's exploring your environment and it's mastering your environment. And that is the task of the school-age child, developing a sense of initiative. I can do things. I can achieve things. I can think up something to do on my own and do it and carry it through to the end. When your brain is trying to regulate itself, that becomes much harder to do, because it's opposite. It's really opposite things that you're trying to do. A brain that's trying to regulate itself is not a brain that's in a fit state to explore. It's hard to explore with a brain that is with a broken tool, as it were. Although your brain is not broken, your brain is too complex and wonderful to ever break. But think of trying to explore somewhere with a broken tool and you will understand it doesn't work. You need to sit down and fix what's going on first. And it will also reduce their ability to do what they need to do developmentally to progress as they should. Right? The longer the stress goes untreated, the more dysregulated and the more skewed the child's development will be. So for instance, I always like to talk about and this is going to show my age, but that's okay, the Chernobyl nuclear accident many, many years ago. And I always remember seeing a documentary about it afterwards. And what had happened was, because of the massive, massive, massive amounts of radiation released into the atmosphere, the trees, the plants growing around Chernobyl had changed. So the person narrating the documentary was showing that up to this stage of the tree's growth, it was, let us say, a cherry tree. At the stage that Chernobyl happened, everything on the tree changed. It was no longer a cherry tree. What it was really not too recognizable, but it had just changed completely. That is the impact, like the impact of trauma on something that is still growing. Your child's brain is still growing. Our brains are growing till we are at least 25 years old. Think about that, sit with it. If there's anybody here who's under 25, congratulations, your brain is still growing. Those of us who are over 25, our brain has achieved its growth. It can still change and learn, but it's achieved its growth. So when you have stress occurring, traumatic stress on a brain that is still growing, an organism that has not fully developed, that is not at mature capacity, that doesn't have coping skills, that doesn't have strengths, that doesn't have experience, that doesn't have knowledge, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for that organism to resist the effects of the trauma in any kind of effective way. And remember, trauma is about something that overwhelms our coping capacities. So the longer the child or adolescent does not get help with the trauma, the more and more his or her development goes off course. The brain can become fixed in a trauma response. A trauma response is an excellent response for survival in a situation of trauma. It's very highly specific. When that brain is taken out of the situation of trauma and has to function in a normal world where survival is not all the time, then that brain is very ill-equipped because it has one response with which to meet the world. One. And that's often what we see in children whose development has been disrupted. It is all about trauma and survival. Yeah? So survival is not a learning and thinking response. It becomes difficult for that brain to learn different responses and different behaviors that are more adaptive and healthier. If anybody has any burning questions at this point, let me know. Nope. Okay, fine. And then we get to loss. Grieving over a loss can take a really long time, sometimes many years. It can take up to 12 years to grieve a loss. And the grieving goes through many stages. So that is a trauma that can stay with you for a long time. So even though the loss has happened, I mean, your parent, let us say, is not dying every single day over again, the fact that they're gone continues to affect your life in many ways. And as children develop, they go through new stages. They react in different ways to the past trauma or loss, especially if it has not been dealt with. So as their understanding grows and their brains develop and they start to understand more about this loss, there can be more grieving, or more about this trauma, there can be more of a reaction to it. So behaviors and emotions related to that one trauma or loss can appear at different periods. So I will take the issue of, let us say, sexual abuse. So a little girl or boy sexually abused at age, let us say 5. And they will have a particular thought or understanding about it then. At 10 years old, let's say, when they are starting to, they know more about the body and they know more about physical intimacy, then they're going to maybe look back and say, oh, wait a second. When they get into adolescence and have their own sexual feelings, which are now meeting up with those memories of sexual trauma, then there's a further understanding and further feelings about it. Anger, grief, shame, because now they're understanding it with more of an adult understanding. A 5-year-old understands this person whom I thought I trusted did this thing that I did not like. It may not have hurt them, but I didn't like it. And I told them to stop and they didn't stop. The 10-year-old is thinking, oh my gosh, somebody did that. They've developed a sense of privacy or sense of their body, and they're thinking, oh my. The 15 or 16-year-old is furious. You took a part of my sexual experience and development away from me. And the 22-year-old or 23-year-old who is getting into a sexual relationship within a marriage, outside a marriage, however it is, again has a new understanding of it and a further understanding, because this is how it has affected me in one of the most intimate relationships of my life. So that is how you can have reactions to the same event growing with the child's development. Trauma in early childhood. And the reason we have a dragon is because sometimes that's what they are when they're dealing with a trauma. And then sometimes they're the little lobster and they're inside the shell and they don't want to come out. And some days they are both within the space of a few minutes. So, trauma in early childhood can affect all these things. I'm sorry, I should have put it on a bullet list. It would have been easier to absorb. Memory, attention, thinking, language, perceptual awareness. These are the things that you perceive visually, your visual field. Regulation of emotions and others. Remember, the earlier that the organism is affected, the more immature its development when it's affected, the more likely it is that there will be a more profound impact of the trauma. Because my brain is now growing as a trauma brain. It's not a 35-year-old brain that has trauma at 35 and has already had a chance to develop many things. If I'm a 4-year-old brain, I'm now developing in some ways as a trauma brain. And this is what these effects can look like, okay? Because you want to know what it looks like. And it can look like the separation anxiety and the clinginess. It can look like regression. So this child who used to be able to bathe themselves is now whining and screaming. The child who could go to the toilet on their own, I'm afraid of the dark, etc. The development is not keeping pace with peers. It can also look like anxiety and fear and worry. This child is chronically worried. They're worried it's going to happen again. One of the things that Sister Julie might remember when we were in Grenada after Hurricane Ivan, a trauma team, whenever it started to rain, children would burst into tears because Ivan was coming back. The small child can develop new fears and they can start asking if the trauma was death, grandmother died, auntie died, sister, whatever. They can start asking what is death and what's dying and are they coming back and where are they and why can't they come back? You can also get a lot more complaints. Little people feel things in their bodies, even more than we do as adults. They feel things in their bodies. So for them, sometimes there isn't any difference between the psychological pain and the physical pain. I hurt. Basically, I hurt. And I always remember somebody saying once that they thought if they took a lot of headache pills, then the pain they felt inside would go away. You can have changes in behavior, so they can be angry, that's the dragon, or they can withdraw like the lobster, and they can be really just difficult and moody to get along with. And they may play out, this is very, very, very common. They may play out the trauma event all the time. They have difficulty with nap time or bedtime. They overreact or they underreact, which is hypoarousal, HYPO, or hyperarousal. So they might be jumping at everything, or they might just, a bomb goes off behind them and they just don't move. So for instance, in Guyana, after the massacres, everybody was in hyperarousal because there had been, one of the places we went to, there had been continuous shooting for about an hour and a half. Everybody was locked in their houses, terrified, not knowing what was going on. There was just shooting going through the streets for an hour and a half. And after that, when there was a loud noise, a lot of people reported that they would just lose control of their bowels or their bladders if they heard any loud noise, because they couldn't take it. So that is little ones. And then we get to the school-age children. And it affects how well they can manage their fears, their anxieties, and their aggression. And again, these are effects on the brain. Also affects how well they can keep their attention for learning and problem solving. So you're seeing some effects that will show up in school now. You're getting many similar behaviors here as with the little ones. So the anxiety, fear, and worry, they're more clingy, they're worried at recurrence of violence, there's increased distress, statements and questions about death and dying, these are all the same. Changes in behavior, increase in activity level, decreased attention or concentration, just cannot keep still, or maybe don't move at all. Then there's a change in behavior, they may withdraw, they may act out, distrusting others, and difficulty with authority, redirection, or criticism. So this is where peer relationships are becoming more important. They're in school. Younger children may be just at home, so they may not have as much of an issue with these two. They still can, but it may not be so much of an issue, or not as often an issue. A change in ability to improve. Now that's a very fancy way of saying that, for example, you may assume that everybody's out to hurt you. So something that I have certainly often seen in institutionalized children or children who've been abused, if you walk towards them and you lift your hand, they immediately fling themselves into a defensive posture. The head flings back and the hands go up to protect the face. Now you may have been reaching out to say, oh look, there's a thread on your shirt. Or you may have been reaching out to say, there's a little bug on your shoulder. Or you may have been reaching out for whatever reason, anything. But you put your hands towards them and you move towards them, and they can't read that body language in a normal way anymore. They are only reading that body language in terms of what they have experienced. So that is where the brain is set on trauma. Trauma about to happen. Somebody moves towards me, somebody lifts a hand, it is always hostile. I am always going to get hurt. There is no other possibility. And that, as you can well imagine, can be extremely difficult. So for instance, you can get children who are walking down the corridor in school, another child passes them, they knock the child to the floor. Of course, they get hauled into the principal's office. This happens too many times, they're in trouble. Why are you doing this? And they say, well, they hit me. And you say, no, I was standing there, I saw the entire thing. They did not raise a hand. Well, they were going to hit me. Why do you think they were going to hit you? They were walking towards me. So for that child, the normal social behavior of passing each other in the corridor If the child moved a little too close because maybe there was a crowd in the corridor, that means you're going to hit me. So I really cannot function except in a hostile situation. Okay. This is something interestingly that you see in like war veterans, where they only feel really, really alive and alert when they're in a crisis situation, and those who have post-traumatic stress, and a lot of the time, the rest of the time they cannot function, but they understand the trauma situation and their brain switches on and their brain functions. Outside the trauma situation, the brain is no longer able to function for everyday life. And interpreting social cues, that's a big part of it. Social cues is body language, the non-verbals that we use to understand what people around us mean, what they want, what they're about to do. So facial expression, body language, your posture, your gestures. You can have the increased physical complaints. Again, as I say, little people, it shows up in the body. The changes in school performance, hard to sit and think when my brain is not regulated. Again, playing out the event, re-experiencing the trauma. This again was something that we saw in Ghana after the massacres. In one place, 12 people had been shot. So we were told, I didn't actually witness it, that the children afterwards kept playing this game where one of them had a gun and then 12 other children had to lie down on the ground and be dead. And that was something that was being played a lot. Because what had happened is the morning after the shooting, the 12 bodies were laid out in a central area of the community. And so a lot of people saw those bodies laid on the ground, and that stayed with the children. These are some very common trauma reactions. The overreacting or underreacting, the hyperarousal, so I can't sleep, I'm startled all the time, avoiding things, going to places that remind you of the event, just being numb. I don't think about it, I don't feel it, it's not there, nothing matters, I don't care. For adolescents, trauma can interfere with quite a lot of stuff because of course, adolescents have more autonomy and more possibility. They can do many, many, many things, and they have lots of avenues to act out their trauma. So, consideration of the consequences of behavior. And I'm going to take a little aside here because I think that I'm actually in pretty good time. And the little aside here is about the adolescent brain. It is undergoing major changes at this stage. The major changes have to do with the areas of the brain that we really associate with maturity and mature thinking. So assessing risk, making choices, judgment, which is weighing up a situation or a person, setting priorities, setting goals, being able to put off pleasure, business before pleasure, which is delaying gratification, assessing risk. All those things are under redevelopment and reconstruction in a teenage brain. So it's a fragile brain. So when you add trauma to that fragile brain, you can get some really explosive consequences. So, oh yes, considering consequences of behavior, this is another part of the brain that's undergoing reconstruction. So for instance, we can have the risky sexual behavior. So I have the possibility for sexual activity, and I don't stop to think about disease. I don't stop to think about possible pregnancy. I don't stop to think about any of the consequences. And when you don't think of those things or plan about those things, consequences are going to happen. So there can be teen pregnancy and birth. Okay, risky sexual behavior is really common with traumatized adolescents. You can also get the adolescent who is up late on his or her own beat in the house or out of the house, we're not sure which, and then they can't focus at school. So I got the opportunity to go out. I really wanted to go out. It sounded like a great line. I'm going out. And maybe I have a test tomorrow. Maybe I have a big exam tomorrow. Maybe I need to hand in a project tomorrow. Maybe I just need to stay awake in school tomorrow. But I can't do any of those things because I seized on what was the opportunity of the moment and I didn't stop to think about what happens if I take this opportunity. Those of us who watched Sesame Street in the 60s and 70s will remember that there was a great segment they had called What Would Happen If? So you would have a child saying, well, I always remember, the one I remember is, I want to pop this balloon. And the child went through thinking, what will happen if I take this pin and pop this balloon? Oh, it might wake up my baby brother. If I take this pin and pop this balloon and it wakes up my baby brother, then he might start to cry. And then the child goes through a whole set of what could happen. And so, of course, decides not to pop the balloon with the pin. But that kind of thinking is often absent, especially with traumatized adolescents. They don't go through that sequence. They don't do a good risk assessment. So they might get into, hey, let's drink. And with drinking, the issue is not simply the drinking or getting drunk, the possibly developing a dependence on the alcohol. It's all those things. It's also what can happen to you while you drink, after you have drunk. What can happen? Because when you drink, you're giving up control. You're allowing your brain to be at less than optimal functioning, so therefore you're losing some of your control. But a traumatized teenager is not thinking it through to that extent a lot of the time. So they're not thinking of all those risks. It's simply, hey, I'm just going to have two, and my friend's going to drive me home, and it's no big deal. I'm not driving, so what? And sometimes, even if they are driving, it's like, oh, well, so what? I've done it before, so I can do it again. If I didn't die before, I'm not going to die now. Ability to govern behavior and meet longer-term goals. So that's the good old self-control. Impulse control, that's one of the things that is also undergoing reconstruction. So we can have, I need to go out there and I need to party. So that's my goal right now, and I'm not thinking further than the party and my 4-inch high party shoes. And I'm not able to control my impulses. I don't control my aggression. I feel it, I do it. I just act it out. There it goes. And of course, consequences. I might get really beat up by somebody. They might come back with a gang and really damage me. They might hurt my family. I could wind up at the police station because I might really hurt somebody. So these things, let me just go back quickly. Consideration of the consequences of behavior, the realistic appraisal of risk, controlling your behavior and your impulses, and thinking long term, strongly affected by trauma. I'm going to put a special note here on alcohol and drugs, and this is for adolescents and pre-adolescents. Please, please keep in mind, substance abuse is not exclusive to adolescence, doesn't just start in adolescence. I used to work part-time at a drug rehab, and I informally collected some statistics there and just did a rough analysis of them at one point. And from a grouping of, I can't remember how many men, might have been 60, 75 men over time who had come in, on average, they had started regularly using a substance by age 12. So that's late primary school or early high school. So pre-adolescents may get into alcohol or drugs to avoid their feelings, to numb themselves. So it can happen quite young. So the reminders of trauma may create the cravings, but then the substance abuse further impairs them, because when you're dependent on a substance, you don't develop other coping strategies to deal with distressing and traumatic distress. And then, of course, you may have the further trauma to deal with of parents who are very angry, upset, threatening to call the police because you have marijuana in the house, threatening to call your friend's parents because they sold you the marijuana or they got it for you, etc., etc., etc. So it helps to create a host of other traumas. So substance abuse as a behavior response to trauma is a very, very difficult one. And there is quite a bit of evidence that marijuana use, particularly with a growing teenage brain, is really, really toxic and dangerous. It's high risk because that brain is still growing. And that is particularly high risk. So, and you may engage, in other behaviors that can lead you to additional trauma, like the risky sexual behavior, like committing a crime when you're high. A lot of gangs, they get you in order to go out there and do an armed robbery or to shoot somebody or whatever. First you get high. And that has a long history because that's also what used to happen in the Vietnam War, which is why so many Vietnam War veterans came back to the US addicted to drugs because they took drugs to be able to go out there and do what they did. Because the average age of the soldier in the Vietnam War was 19. So that's an adolescent we're talking about. That's still an adolescent. So drug use, adolescent brain, significant trauma because war is a big T trauma. And so you have, unsurprisingly, some of the best studies, the most information about post-traumatic stress disorder is from studying veterans of the Vietnam War, because so many of them were showing the symptoms. Okay, I need to go back here. I'm going to go to a different screen to share at this point. I want to go to this. Right. So can somebody please tell me, I can't see the chat, so can somebody please tell me if you're seeing a screen that says ACEs? Can't hear. Are we seeing a screen that says ACEs?
Yes.
Yes? Good, thank you. Adverse childhood experiences. This came out of a study done over 20 years ago by a big health insurance company in the US. It happened kind of by accident, actually. And they were looking at adverse childhood experiences, and what they discovered, some very interesting stuff. So what they called adverse childhood experiences, these are some of what we call trauma. So abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, physical or emotional neglect, household dysfunction, so mental illness of somebody in the household, relative in jail, mother suffering domestic violence, somebody in the house who is on substances, abusing substances, divorce. So they were measuring.
Can you click the next slide, please?
Can I what?
Please click the next slide.
When you say click the next slide, you're not seeing the ACEs?
No, we just got adverse childhood experiences, but nothing on the slide.
Okay. So I'm still not sharing. Thank you. I'm going to, let me come back to Zoom. I'm going to stop the share, right? And now I'm going to share this one. Okay, now you should get it. Thank you, Tina. Okay, so now are you seeing it? Let me move this.
Yes.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
That's it.
Okay, so they are adverse childhood experiences, as I was saying, and these are the types, the three types: the abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, the neglect, physical and emotional, household dysfunction, mental illness of someone in the household, relative who's incarcerated, somebody who would normally be in the household, mother suffering violence in the household, substance abuse in the household, and divorce. So it's 10 here. 10 different, that was the original study. It asked if one of those 10 things had happened to you. And for each one you said yes to, you got a score, you got 1 point. So this is what was found. This is why knowing about trauma is so important. Now, it's probably hard for you to see, but at least you can see this. The number of ACEs you have, the number of points out of 10 you have increases. So does the risk for negative health outcomes. Okay, so the risk gets acute once you have 4 or more. It's bad once you have 3 or more. It's really acute once you have 4 or more. And it affects your behavior, your physical and mental health. So, and this was 17,000 people in that original study. And of those, it's hard to see this. Let me see if I can, I can enlarge it. So, oops, so that you can see 64% had at least one. 12% approximately had 4 or more. 9.5% had 3 or more. So a little over 20%, 1 in 5 people were at some pretty high risk for some later bad health outcomes. Okay, and these are the bad health outcomes that you got. You got the behavior outcomes, more likely to not be physically active, to smoke, to be alcoholic, use drugs, and to miss work, which of course you will with drug use and alcoholism. Physical and mental health affected, more likely to be severely obese, to have diabetes, to be depressed, to have made suicide attempts, to have sexually transmitted diseases, to have heart disease, cancer, stroke. This is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, to affect your lungs severely, to have broken bones. These were all connected. You found these more often in people who had a higher ACEs score. Okay, so I'm going to stop share here, right, and go back to my slides, and right. Right, so the next one, this is the health problems. Oops, sorry. Twice as likely to smoke, 7 times as likely to be alcoholic, 6 times as likely to have had underage sex, twice as likely to have had cancer, or heart disease, 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. Men with 6 or more ACEs, which is pretty high, 46 times more likely to have injected drugs than men with no history who had no ACEs. Much more likely to have chronic health issues. And when they say high predictability, that means that it is very good at predicting that you will have some or many of these problems. So absorb that for a little bit. Those ACEs: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction in children and adolescents. This is what you can see in adulthood. And this is all because there has been a chronic impact on your brain, which means chronic impact on your behavior, which means chronic impact and significant impact on your life outcomes. Right. We're going to move on to a little bit of specific talk about loss and grieving. And these are some of the phases of mourning. Now, these phases are not one after the other. This happens, this happens, this happens. No, that's not how human thinking and emotion works. So they overlap. So you may cycle back, because we're going to talk about a cycle coming up. And emotions may be felt in a particular stage, in all the other stages as well. Okay, so it's not cut and dried and not a very clear separation. There are different models with phases of mourning. There's one that is well known that was first done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which is, I think it's anger or denial, anger, bargaining, grieving, acceptance. I believe that's those. This is a different one, but it's got its similarities. So the first stage is numbness, and you're in shock. And there's a no, it didn't happen. No, that did not happen. So, for instance, someone who has passed on, whenever you hear somebody coming past on the road, at the time that they used to come home, let's say, you think it's them. Okay? The disbelief, for instance, very interesting. It's something that you can see in, that I remember seeing in a documentary about conjoined twins who had to be separated, or they would both die, but only one could be saved. And the other one, after the surgery, and they were still babies, they were not a year old, kept turning her head and looking, because where was her sister? So she kept looking around, very puzzled. So she was experiencing, this doesn't make sense. So you get the disbelief. No, I'm not accepting this reality. This didn't happen. Shock is when you're just too stunned, you can't take anything in. That can last for quite a long time. So can the disbelief. This phase can last a long time. And then you're longing for the person. You're thinking about them, you're remembering things for the person or the situation. You're looking for them. You're imagining you hear them, you hear their footstep, you hear their voice, or you think you're back in the situation or the place. There's a lot of anger. There may be guilt because maybe I did something, maybe I deserved to lose this wonderful thing, this wonderful person, this thing that I miss so much. And sometimes you're literally out looking for them. So again with babies, because you can see these stages of loss in quite young babies. Depression was observed in, I think, a London hospital way back maybe the 50s in babies who had been the practice then was if the baby had to come to the hospital for a procedure, they made the parents leave the baby there, which now is not done. And the parents had to go home, so the baby was just left there. So the child, of course, is looking around the room and crying and vocalizing, where are my familiar people? What's going on? So you can get this. This is longing and searching and wanting it back as much as you can, angry that it's gone, angry that it left you, angry that you can't have it back. And what did I do? This is when the energy of longing and looking gives way. Hopelessness and helplessness. That's where you're starting to think this has really happened. I cannot believe it, but this has really happened. They're really gone. This is really over. I've lost this person. I've lost this relationship. I've lost this marriage. I've lost these children. I've lost whatever it is. So then you have these emotions setting in. And fear. I can't make it. My life is falling apart. How can I live without this in my life? I can't live without this in my life. That I can't do anything. It's gone and I cannot do anything. So you see that helplessness, which is a core emotion of trauma that you have there. Fear, remember, terror is one of the core emotions of trauma. Anger, we saw in children and adolescents acting out. There's the anger, a lot of anger, a lot of guilt. Yeah, so let me go back. And finally, you reorganize yourself, your life and your psyche, your mind, reorganize themselves around, okay, my life no longer includes this person, this relationship, this house, this country. My life is now including these people, these relationships, this country, this home. And I build and reorganize my life for these things to be central. So the person, place, country, relationship that I lost that was central now moves to the periphery, and other important relationships, people, places, home, country, take their place and they become central, and I organize my life around that. So there's acceptance that it's gone, it's not coming back. Also acceptance of, and I can go on and have a good life without it. Because a lot of this early struggle, the searching, the remembering, the anger, the hallucination, it's all about, I cannot possibly have a life without this, whatever it was. I can't have a good life without it. So I'm going to keep searching. It's in my mind all the time. I'm remembering it. I'm hearing, smelling, seeing it, or seeing them. I'm angry and guilty because how could I have lost this? But all of this is when I'm refusing to accept that is no longer there, is no longer going to be there in the same way at any rate, that it has changed and that I have to reorient. So I'm still holding on to that as an organizing principle. And the disorganization and despair, this is a necessary stage, because when I let go of something that was formed and is no longer there, and I'm in the transition stage, moving to something that is going to be formed but is not yet, that is a stage of fragmentation, confusion. So I act that out, that comes out in my emotions and in my behavior, because that is a reflection of the change in my life from what was formed to now something that I have to newly form and build and strengthen and make central. So this disorganization it's horrible. It feels dreadful. And that's why you despair, because it feels so difficult. Because you feel my life is formless, shapeless, meaningless without that which I lost. I can't even think of forming a new structure. So you stay in that state of perceived formlessness and shapelessness for some time, and then, all things being equal, you move to start, life goes on, and some of it happens naturally, some of it happens purposefully and deliberately, some of it happens fortuitously, external circumstances, where you start to reorganize. So you can see people going through grieving, let us say, for instance, let's take the corporate world, merger of companies. You may have been kept on at the new company that has been formed. You have a new job title. You are working in a new location. You have some different co-workers. There's a different management structure. So there's a structure there that is ready for you to walk into. But psychologically, you're still going to have this. You're still going to have this, because where are all the people I used to work with, and we don't do things the same way we used to, and I don't have the same people to report to, and who am I going to have coffee with because so-and-so wasn't kept on and they're gone. It's a lot of grieving, but there's the external structure. So when your brain and your emotions are ready, they have that external structure to help them. There's something there externally that's already organized. You internally have to reorient yourself and say, this is what this is now. This has certain advantages. This has certain pluses. Yes, there's still things I miss about my former workplace. I can still see that this has some advantages and I can live with this, and this can be a good thing in my life. And then there's relief, because you're no longer in that intense emotional and psychic pain. And this was a model that is originally developed for adults, but the same thing happens with children. For instance, let me take you through it quickly, because we have a few minutes before we have to start the case studies. And children go through this when parents divorce. No, it's not really happening. No, mommy and daddy not going to do that. So, mommy and daddy been living apart for 9 months. Mommy and daddy have announced very clearly that this is done. And children and teenagers are saying to you, no, they still going to get back together. They refuse to believe that it is over. Okay? And they're in shock. How could this happen? And then they go through this. They're remembering all the good times. They're really angry. They're angry with their parents. They're angry with life. They're angry with everybody on earth. They're angry with themselves. They're feeling guilty. Maybe it was my fault. What did I do? I was bad. All their fights were over me. So this is all about me. If I hadn't been a certain kind of way, then this would not have happened. They are, especially the parent who's they're no longer living with, they're constantly searching for and yearning for that parent all the time. if they hear somebody come in the door at the time that parent used to come home, oh my gosh, daddy's home or mommy's home. And then they catch themselves. So they go through that for quite a while. And then there's this phase. They're really not getting back together. They're heartbroken. The children are heartbroken. They're distraught. This is so terrible. They can't believe this. What are we going to do? And they grieve and grieve and grieve. Lots of tears, lots of sadness, lots of loneliness, because they feel as though, who can I talk to about this? Nobody will understand. And it's hard for them to realize that this happens to a lot of children, so you're not alone. There's the ambivalence, because they may be starting to feel, well, especially if the parents' marriage was difficult or relationship was difficult, well, there's some good things about it, but then they think, oh no, I shouldn't think that. They're afraid, how is life going to go on when I'm now living with just one parent? How is this going to work? If something happens to this parent, who takes care of me? So there's a lot of that. And then with help and support, they get to this place. They might never like the fact that their parents split up, but they can accept that, okay, maybe it was better than how things were. And there's some relief. We don't have to deal with the bad parts of their relationship anymore. We're moving on and things are different and things are better now and everybody's getting along better, and I'm seeing that my life can be good and I can still have both my parents. So children and adolescents go through same stages, exact same stages. And now it is exactly time for us to move on to case studies. I did 4 of these just to point out the ways in which the things we've been talking about can manifest. So 2 for grief and 2 for trauma, and child and adolescent. Okay, so the first one is childhood grief. So I'm going to leave that up, give you a few minutes to look it over, and then we can talk it through. So the first thing we're looking at is that this child had the trauma of the death of a parent, and remember that that is one of the worst traumas a child can have at age 6. So he was just school age at that time. And he used to ask for him, that's the yearning. Also at 6, they're kind of on the borderline of really understanding death, because they don't understand forever. So it's hard to understand that somebody's gone forever. And this is a child where at the time, you didn't see a lot of reaction. And this is another thing that happens with trauma, that you don't, with children and adolescents, you don't necessarily see the reaction at the time, especially when they are little. They're so accustomed to not having control of their lives, and things happen. So, okay, this happened, and so we keep going. The adults around me are taking care of me, and they're managing my life, and we're just going forward, and life keeps going, and I go to school, and I come home, and I still play with my friends, and I still have my puppy, and food is on the table, and I go to bed at the same hour. Okay. And this is where we're talking about things affecting you, coming back to affect you at different stages. So at 6, I'm missing daddy and I'm asking for him, and I don't quite understand what's going on. Now I'm 10. I'm now understanding death. So he's not able to focus in school. He's having trouble focusing, sustaining attention. Remember, this is one of the things with the school-age child. Difficulty, and I can cheat here because I have my notes right in front of me. I'm sorry I can't show you the screen to show you at the same time, but one of the issues with school-age children is trauma affects how well they can sustain attention for learning and problem solving. And so you may get the change in school performance, and you can get the change in behavior, right? So, and remember we talked about for both young children and school-age children, anxiety, fear, and worry about safety of self and others, statements and questions about death and dying, and they can be more clingy with parents. Right, so he's got a change in school performance. He's lying about the homework because he can't cope with it. At home, very well behaved, and he's following his mother and saying, I'll help you. He wants to make sure that he has her in sight all the time, and he also wants to make sure that he's helping her out so that she's not stressed. So he's clingy. And then when she had to lie down, this child had a fear that the event was going to recur. And that is one of the things that we mentioned as well. Worry about recurrence of the event. So he's worried his father disappeared suddenly, his father died suddenly. Maybe the same thing is happening, maybe the same thing is happening with mommy. So I'm hysterical because she says she has a headache. And maybe that means she's going to die. So there's the worries about death and dying. And so the mommy is like, but what's going on? We were doing well. It's been 4 years. He was fine. All was going just, perfectly okay. He's reached a different developmental stage. More things, more reactions are happening. And this child now understands death. So there you are. You're getting the school performance issues, you're getting the clinginess, you're getting the worries, and it's 4 years after the fact. So we're going to go to the adolescent grief. I'll give you a couple minutes to look over this one. So this is a teenager. It's always good to look at the age at which the trauma happened or at which it started happening. So this child had a loss. Grandmother was 16 when grandmother died. Now, in actual fact, the trauma started at 15 when Susie was 15 because grandmother had a year of going down in health. So this child has had a year of trauma, chronic trauma situation, because trauma can be a situation. If you remember, some of our big T traumas were situations like sexual assault, war, etc. So she had that traumatic situation, then the event, the loss event. So she was losing her grandmother over a year and then the final loss. She's the oldest grandchild, spent a lot of time with her grandmother. Now this child looked like she did everything appropriately. She was sad at the time. She expressed her grieving. She spoke at the funeral. did everything she was supposed to do. Okay. It's a year later. It is a year later, and now we're getting this. Loud and aggressive. So this is ability to govern behavior, breaking school, and buying and using marijuana. So she's not considering the consequences of her behavior. She had this trauma start in her mid-teenage years, 15, and went on for a year, and then the death when grandmother was 16, all in her mid-teen years. And so this child has been affected in many ways. The things we spoke about before, where the brain is undergoing reconstruction for the mature behavior. Well, here we are. She's being affected in all those ways. She's very secretive, probably because she's buying and using the marijuana. Coming out of school, so school performance affected, which tends to happen at all ages. Flying into rages, so she's not controlling her temper at all. And this is important. It's the anniversary of her grandmother's death. So there's often what we call an anniversary effect, where the month or the day or the time of year that the trauma occurred is a particularly difficult time for the child or adolescent to face. It's very, very painful for them. And she's refused to go to the church service. Now, she loves her grandmother.
Money for gas.
Somebody's mic is on.
Yes. Can you mute?
That's the whole car money, no, nothing in spend.
Gwen, can you move your mic, please, Gwen?
Okay, thanks, Tina. Thank you, Gwen. So she's close to the grandmother. She spent a lot of time with the grandmother. She's not going to the church service because she cannot deal with the pain of that loss. So she's using the substance, as we talked about. They may use alcohol or drugs to avoid overwhelming emotions. And she cannot deal with the church service. She cannot deal with remembering her grandmother's death. So she's probably still in the stage of, if we go back here, she's here. She's probably here. Disorganization and despair. And she's probably also feeling the disbelief, and I refuse to accept this. No, this did not happen. And yearning for her grandmother. So you can, be feeling all these things at once. So that's where Susie is with the loss. And can't deal with being reminded of it. Okay. Next one is trauma. So I'll give you a minute or two to look through that one.
Will we be allowed to ask questions about these at the end, or do you want to take the question about the previous one now?
We can do the questions at the end. Yeah, if you can, or if whoever has a question can hold it for the end, and I'll just take the screen back. So because we have this one and then the last one, and then we'll go into the questions.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we have little D, who's 6. Years of verbal and physical violence. So this is a chronic situation of chronic abuse. And so there's some chronic trauma there. And this child is only 6. So you are getting, so she's school age. But the trauma in early childhood, remember, can affect attention, regulation of emotions, among other things. So she's rude and she fights. So there is, let me see, changes in behavior. So you can have angry outbursts and you can be irritable and moody. And that's for the trauma in early childhood. And recreating the traumatic event. That's what this child is doing. She's fighting. She is fighting. Her little brain is now tuned to the trauma station, and she fights or she cries, which is what she would have seen. You're either the one who's beating up or the one who's being beaten on. And when you're the aggressor, you're rude and you fight and you're defiant. And when you're overpowered, you break down in tears. And this child is playing that cycle out over and over and does not understand because she's blaming the other children. Now, when we see children doing this, we often think, oh, you little liar. Oh, how could you tell such a story? And they really don't see, little ones, how they made this thing happen. Because they're playing out sometimes the same kind of cycle as little D. And this is the cycle that she knows. And she doesn't understand it's not her fault. That's what she thinks. Again, she's recreating the situation. So they don't always recreate it innocently and nicely through play. Sometimes they recreate it by doing it again. Okay? So she shouts and she slaps. This is what she's seeing. And she picked up a weapon because when she's frustrated or upset, that's what you do. You hit, and you hit with an implement. And then, and this one is usually very, very difficult for mothers who've lived with domestic violence, when the child turns around and says, I'm going to get daddy to come and beat you. It's really common. And it happens because I don't experience you as a powerful person. I saw daddy overpower you. You're not powerful and you're not strong enough to protect me. Because if you were, you want to let all of that happen and let me see it. And plus, the way that I deal with feeling overpowered is I either get a weapon or I get a bigger person with a weapon who will do the beating up for me. And again, this child she's playing out what she's seen. And when I say playing out, I don't mean literal play, but she's recreating it and reliving it, which is what they do at that age. So this is what Dee is doing. She's showing all those reactions. These are all kind of composites of different cases that, you know, I may have seen over the years that have come to my attention. It's not any one person or case or situation. It is a combination. But this is the typical behavior. So this could have been any 6-year-old in this situation, boy or girl. The last one is trauma in adolescence. And trauma can look like this. Let me give you a couple more minutes to finish reading it. So trauma does not always look like horrible, terrible acting out, fighting, carrying on, using drugs, although he is drinking. It doesn't have to look like that. Trauma can look like this. He's a star boy. He's great. He's doing well. So people are going to look at him and say, but he's doing so well. So clearly, everything he's been through, it must have been okay because he's doing so well. Except he isn't. He's leveraging these qualities and some music skills, very popular. That's what he's riding on. Those are his coping strategies right now. So homework is late, he's missing classes, he's missing school, right? He's had some chronic trauma. Father disappeared, which was one, and then the several stepfathers, all of whom led to further traumatic situations. So he's had the trauma, mother's had the trauma, the boys have probably witnessed the mother's trauma as well as had their own, the abuse, seeing the alcoholism. And so we have not considering the consequences of the behavior. We have not considering the risks of behavior, right? We have not governing his behavior because he's drinking and meet his longer term goals. He's not doing the work, he's missing the classes, he's missing school. His opportunities are slipping away from him. He doesn't have the longer term plan. He's looking really, really good. And sadly, for somebody like Bill, this might be the best he ever looks when he's still in a school structure and more or less in a school structure because he's starting to slip out of it. But he's more or less in a school structure. He has the school support, the social network. He has a place where he can look good. When he drops out of that school structure, either through failing out his exams or just stopping altogether, then he loses. He loses a lot, which he doesn't realize. He's losing his future because he won't have qualifications to go any further. He's losing support networks and adults who are willing to be supportive of him. He's losing a place where he's successful and looks good. Because all of this, handsome, tall, handsome, good musician, popular, once he's out of school and has no visible means of support, and on paper is somebody without any passes, or probably any possibility of getting passes, he's no longer looking like a success. And he doesn't understand that because his ability to meet longer term goals is not there. He's doing the drinking because he's trying to avoid the emotions, many, many, many emotions, and he's looked good for a long time. He protects his younger brother, probably used to try and protect him from the stepfathers too, right? So he's looked good for a long time, but there's significant damage and hurt going on. So all of this here is fooling people. The teachers need to not be making allowances. They need to be having some sort of intervention. They've spoken to him about this, but as long as he's getting the allowances made for him and he's able to ride on all these qualities, then he's slipping further and further and further into a hole, and it's not being seen. And what really would be the best thing for Bill would be for the teachers saying, no, we are not tolerating this. We are having a meeting with your mother. We are talking to the ministry. We are, putting a lot of things in place. We are pulling up here. In other words, we are going to hold you accountable because they're not holding him accountable. We're going to hold you accountable. We're going to demand from you what we think you can give so that you can have a future. So this is what trauma can look like in adolescence as well. It can be very disguised. In all these cases, there can be a lot of, well, D is not disguised at all, but the others kind of disguised. Susie was looking good for a while. So was Tim. D is the only one who never disguised, but everybody else did. And that misunderstanding of behavior can lead to approaching it in exactly the wrong way and making bad worse. So we've now reached the question segment. I'm not going to be able to really see who is asking what. I will try because I've got stuff up on this. I'm still sharing the screen, so I think somebody had a question. Now is the time for questions.
Yes, does Gwen want to ask her question now? I see she wrote it on the chat.
Okay, if I go to the chat, I think I have to.
I can read it.
Okay, please, thank you.
It says, is the best thing to allow children to return and live in a place where a parent was killed and they were witness to it?
Okay, I'm seeing it here. No, it's not. It actually isn't. Because that can be triggering for them. That can be triggering. The walls, the room, everything there, even when you reorganize everything in the space, this is the location where it occurred. And that's very, very difficult. So the children, I would guess, would need a lot of support. Because even if they were quite little, just being back in that environment may trigger some memories that are puzzling and difficult and really painful for them. Because what happens in a traumatic event is our visual, the visual part of our brain, the visual cortex, starts to work much more powerfully. It's much more activated. Our words disappear, but we are seeing everything, which is what you need in a situation of survival. You need to be aware of everything that's going on. You need to be hyper alert. And so your eyes are taking in and registering things that you don't even consciously remember. So one day walking into a room and standing in a particular angle against the wall, that may have been where you were when you saw things happen. And you don't understand why you panic when you walk into that room, why you cannot stand against that wall, why the color of the room bothers you so much. Because your brain is getting triggered. So that's a very difficult thing and would have to be extremely carefully handled.
Okay, thank you. But they were advised to not run away from it. And told the best thing was to go back to the home and face it. So, you know,
You see,
you
see, if you are going to give the people the tools and the support to face it, but just to go back there and say, okay, walk back into that memory and live with it every day, no. That's not about being strong. That's not being strong. It is subjecting your brain to the memory of that trauma over and over and over again, many times a day, every single day. If you just go back so without any change, without any support, without any preparation, without any working through, just go back and face it, no. And it's not running away from it. Your brain is triggered. This is not a conscious, I don't want to do this. This is the neurology of your brain. Trauma does in one action. Your brain usually takes a lot of repetition to build up associations and a routine and to remember things and to have things embedded. If you think of learning to tie shoelaces when you were little, now you do it without even thinking. You can do it half asleep. You can do it with your eyes shut. But when you were little, your eyes had to look at what your fingers were doing, but now your fingers have that memory. It is just automatic. But that took a long time. With trauma, that kind of learning happens in an instant. It's like that thing was grooved 1,000 times into your brain. So when they walk back in there, all that their brain learned in that instant of violence, anger, death, pain, screaming, blood, whatever, all those things that the brain quote unquote learned, they are there and they're powerful. And you can't stop that. Well, over time, you can learn to work with it and reduce the intense emotion connected to it. But it's not like you can stop your brain just like that from doing it, from having those associations. The brain is rehearsing what it's learned. Oh yes, here we are, we're standing in this house, and then there's going to be screaming and a knife and blood and somebody on the floor and the sound of somebody's skull hitting the floor. Your brain is going to go through it again. So it's not go back and face it. No. Okay.
Thank you.
Can someone be traumatized?
I want to take the next one from Belinda.
Okay, I've actually got it, managed to get it on the screen so I can see it. Thanks, Tina. Can somebody be traumatized from the womb? I think there's growing evidence that yes, that can happen because the fetus is not completely, it's not insensible. There's evidence that a newborn baby can recognize the mother's voice, having heard the mother's voice for 9 months. So the mother's voice is more familiar to it than others. So the fetus can have experiences, and there's growing research about that. Like, for instance, children who have suffered violence in utero, because there's often a lot of domestic violence when a woman is pregnant and more helpless. So yes, you can be traumatized. It can affect your growth and your development in the womb, and therefore your growth and development after. You can be traumatized by malnutrition in the womb. Smaller brain, less developed, less fat in the brain, because you need fat in the brain for the brain to learn properly, etc. Other questions? Can someone suffer from being sexually? Yes, they can. Absolutely, yes, they can. For those who are not seeing it, can someone suffer PTSD from being sexually molested even when they don't remember the incident? Yes, because what you do not remember, this is one of the great things that Sigmund Freud gave to the world. What you don't remember can still affect you. In fact, it affects you more than the stuff you do remember, because the stuff you do remember, you can face, you can deal with. The stuff you don't remember is hidden and it's attacking you from your subconscious. So definitely, you can be, in fact, a lot of the time, survivors of sexual abuse have very patchy memories of it. They don't always have a good, clear, sharp memory of this happened with this person. And that is because sometimes they dissociate. They're not there. They're not consciously there. Their brain disengages. So what's happening to them is like it's happening to somebody else, and they don't have a memory of it afterwards. But oh yes, definitely it can affect you in a most significant way, whether you remember it or not. And sometimes people can only identify that they've been abused because of their behavior, their pattern of life, their way of thinking about themselves, and the mental health professional picks up, you know, you're showing all these patterns of abuse, all these patterns. So, and then the person confronted with the possibility may start to remember things. They might never remember everything clearly, but it's there in their life. Which point
Excuse me, Karen.
Sorry,
Karen,
sorry.
could I just share something?
Sure, please.
Okay, everybody, this is Delia from Dominica, and just to back up what Karen said, I encountered a woman who had been sexually abused before she was of preschool age, but she had no memory of it. She grew up, she was very intelligent, but all during her life, she realized that she had an aversion to slimy things. So gels and anything slimy would make her skin crawl, but she never questioned it. She never knew what was going on. She went on to become a nurse.
Okay,
And even
Delia,
when she,
Delia,
yes,
I just want to pause you a second because I just
yes,
wanted to make sure that no details were given that could in any way identify this woman.
no, I won't.
Okay, good. Right. Go ahead.
So she went on to become a nurse. And anytime she had to do a gynecological examination of a client, she would do it, but she would have to be grinding her teeth because she had to be using gels and all of that. At some point in her life, she went out of state to attend a seminar. And while she was at the seminar, the memory suddenly came back. And she was in so much physical pain that she fell out of the chair that she was in. And they had to call the ambulance, remove her from the space. And they thought she was going crazy because they did all of the examinations and they couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. But then she slowly began remembering. Fast forward, she remembered everything. She was able as an adult to confront the abuser, who was surprised that she even remembered. And whether it was guilt or remorse, he admitted, he did apologize, but she, although she has dealt with it in that way, she has been unable to maintain any sort of romantic relationship with anybody, because anytime it comes to getting intimate with somebody, then she just has to stop. She pushes the person away and all of that. So she has suffered her entire life because of that.
Thank you for sharing that. That is an example of you're not remembering it, but it does affect your life. Thank you for that. So we have a question. At what point should the teenager in the trauma cycle / stages of loss, should a teenager be held accountable for things like school and schoolwork? I think that there's always accountability, but for me, accountability doesn't mean that you have to be doing school and doing schoolwork in the same way that you normally would. Because if you were, for instance, God forbid, hospitalized, if the teenager was hospitalized, I'm not expecting these things from you. The fact that we can't see the injury doesn't mean it's not there. What I would say is there must be a plan. There must always be a plan. And I have recommended that teenagers, I look at them and I say, you know what? You need to stop school for a while because you cannot cope. I think that you can be held accountable when you are able to function and cope. But there are times when you recognize this teenager cannot function and cope with school. It's not happening. And those, interestingly, are usually the teenagers who are overconscientious and who beg you not to take them out of school. They're prepared to have the nervous breakdown every day as long as they can still do school. So there must be a plan, and I think you can be held accountable when you are at a place where you can cope with it, even if it's partially, even if it's for half a day. And sometimes it takes some experimentation to find out what you can cope with. But you need to be held accountable for what you can cope with. What can be done if the teenager after trauma doesn't take responsibility for his action? They often don't. They often don't. And that doesn't mean that this is an irresponsible teenager who just doesn't care. This may be a teenager who's feeling a huge amount of guilt already. So when I have to take responsibility for the fact that I was drinking, that I was using the marijuana, that I was this, that I was that, it's like asking somebody to take responsibility for sneezing when they've got a cold. It's not saying these actions are okay and acceptable, and you certainly work to try and prevent these actions from happening. But it is just like, I know you'll sneeze when you have a cold. I'm going to get you medication. I'm going to try to build up your immune system. I'm going to do all the things to help you get over this cold and not sneeze. But I'm not going to judge you for it. So I think it's really important, the perspective that is taken. And maybe this young person is not at a point where they can take responsibility for it, because there's just too much happening. It depends on the young person. It depends on the situation. But of course, I'm seeing things through a mental health lens. So for me, when I know what's going on, when I know the level of trauma, I'm probably absolutely not expecting you to take responsibility. And that's not my focus at that point. My focus is to help you not be unsafe again. First, I want to help you be safe. And that may mean a lot of structure and a lot of accountability and a lot of somebody comes to pick you up from school, when school was on, and takes you straight back home. Somebody may be monitoring the device, whatever. But I want to make sure you're safe first from yourself. And then at some point, with a traumatized teenager, they often reach the place with enough support and working through issues where they take responsibility. And what you often find is a huge amount of guilt. Huge amount of guilt. Oh my gosh, 5 new messages. Let's go. Let's see. Oh, this. All right. Oh, good. Tina, thank you. You're inviting everyone to the WhatsApp group. I'm just going up a little bit. What would you recommend for adolescents who have suffered a number of small t and big T traumas, who have exhibited some of the dysfunctional behavior and have had minimal counseling? Is it possible for them to still be fully reorganized and reach a point of acceptance and relief? Yes, it is always possible. If they can't have the professional counseling, it might be that a group would help, with somebody facilitating the group who is functioning well, who has good insight. If it could be a professional person, great. Mental health professional. If not, then maybe someone who's getting some support from a mental health professional, who's further along in his or her journey than these teens, and who can help them. Support groups are great. They are really great once they run well, and they're not a place for people exploiting other people. So they have to be carefully structured and well monitored. So there has to be a lot of goodwill and taking responsibility for the group. But a group can be a good support. And yes, it is absolutely possible for these young people to be reorganized. One of the most helpful things for young people who are in situations of high risk is a relationship with a consistent, caring adult. safe adult in their lives. That kind of relationship can be very, very repairing. And that's in the research. So yes, it is possible for the adolescents and young adults to pick up the pieces and become reorganized. Moving down, somebody's helping to understand reaction to a trauma under the age of 7, and I'm glad it helped. And Tina is inviting to the next WhatsApp group. And are there any further questions? We are exactly on 6:59. Okay, if there are absolutely no further questions, then this is the point I'm going to stop the sharing and come back. And I really want to thank everyone on behalf of the Franciscan Institute Trauma Team. I would really like to thank everyone who came, who stayed, who took it in, who asked questions. We really appreciate your presence here tonight. This is all, as Sister Julie said earlier, in the service of continuing our work with the Caribbean community, because hopefully this will help people when, if you, God forbid, you have to deal with a hurricane this year, which none of us need. We do not need it. Not on top of COVID. Don't need it. We're good. But we wanted to help build capacity out there. So this is part of what we're doing, for people to be informed, because it's people out in the communities who have to work with everybody, especially now when we can't travel, at least from Trinidad. We can't go anywhere. Our borders are closed. So we can't go out to you except in this way, which we're really glad we can facilitate. I'm seeing some very kind messages coming up in the chat. Thank you very much. Tina, I don't know what you would like to say on behalf of Lifeline Dominica, who again helped put this together, did the survey, seeing what people were interested in, have been instrumental in getting this going.
Well, I'm getting lots and lots of happy messages in my WhatsApps and all around, and I'm delighted. Karen, you've done great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you, and we're looking forward to coming back again for the next time that you can share with us. People, please send me your contact details so I can make sure you don't miss another chapter from Karen and other colleagues. I think we will also be able to find several other resources who are in lockdown.
Right. Okay, so thank you very much, Tina. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now because this has been recorded. I will let you know, because I'm on the WhatsApp chat, so we'll send out when it has been put up on the Franciscan Institute YouTube channel. So those who want to look over it again, those who missed it or part of it, somebody said the internet went down, people who wanted to come but were unable to, it will be there and it will be available. So I want to thank everybody again, and somebody's saying, will the slides be available? The recording will be available on the YouTube channel. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Please have a very good night and weekend, and everybody, please stay safe. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.